Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deepest part of the night. Make sure you're comfortable and fully settled in for a long one. Tonight, we're doing something therapeutic, combining the calming sound of a thunderstorm with unsettling, long-form stories to help your mind slip into the darkness while your body unwinds. If this fusion of fear and relaxation feels like your kind of therapy, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss more long nights of narrative dread. Share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, let the rain wrap around you, and allow the stories to pull you into the night. Story 1. My name is Marcus, and for the last 10 years, my passion, my job, really, has been chasing whispers in the dark. I run a small team of paranormal investigators, but we're not theatrics guys. We use hard data, thermal cams, and EMF meters. Most of the time, it's nothing: bad plumbing, rodents, old buildings doing what old buildings do. But then there's a place like Blackwood. You might have heard of Blackwood Asylum. It's tucked away in the deepest part of Vermont, a relic of 19th century failure and misery. A proper Gothic eyesore with a cruel, shadowed history. It was abandoned in 1958, shortly after that damning state report about patient mistreatment, questionable surgeries, and a genuinely horrific rash of inmate suicides. Local legend says that the worst among the staff, the cold-blooded doctor, Samuel Thorne, mainly, never truly left. We got the formal permission, a surprisingly tedious process, to do a 48-hour solo investigation. It was Nate who was behind the gear, my partner since college and our tech expert, and there was Liam, who did ground surveillance and logistics. The place was vast, cold, and utterly silent. The air held a particular, bone-dry chill that had nothing to do with outside temperature. It felt stuffed with silence, a sound vacuum waiting to implode. We set up our base in the administration block. Our first 12 hours of recordings turned up silch, high EMF spikes near the old electric shock therapy room, which was predictable, and the typical structural sounds of a building settling. The unease, though, was immediate and suffocating. It was less a feeling of being watched and more a sensation of intruding on something still happening. The second night, we moved our focus to the patient wards on the third floor. This was the place where most of the deaths occurred. We positioned 5 audio recorders and 4 trigger cams, small, motion-activated gadgets notorious for catching what our eyes miss. Nate stayed behind in the van monitoring the primary recording feeds while Liam and I started a trigger session in the main day room. Just state your name, the location, the time, and anything you hear, Liam reminded me, checking his pistol flashlight. Copy that. It's 1:47 a.m., Friday, October 27th. Marcus Reed, Ward Block Alpha, Blackwood Asylum. If anyone or anything is present with us, communicate with a sound. Move an object. Give us a sign. The next 30 minutes passed in typical paranormal quiet, just 2 grown men whispering theories to the darkness. We packed up and returned to the lobby, where we'd set up a portable workstation to review the footage instantly. We'd done about 10 minutes of fast-forward playback through the third-floor audio when Nate called on the radio, his voice a suddenly too loud burst in the silence. Guys, come on. Stop messing with the environmental mic in the East Dining Hall. It's unprofessional. He sounded annoyed. We have been in the ward block for the past hour and a half, I replied, frowning. No access to the dining hall. We're in the admin lobby. There was a heavy pause on Nate's end. Okay, check your audio for the third floor session. Now 1:55 mark. Trust me. Nate, Liam, and I huddled over the laptop. We fast-forwarded to 5 minutes into the recording we'd just finished up in the day room. At first, it was just silence, the low-level electrical hum we always hear. Then, exactly at the 1:55 mark, there it was. It wasn't a whisper. It was an audible gasp followed by what I can only describe as a wet, wrenching sort of scream. And then another, a muffled, hopeless cry that seemed to be coming from only about 10 feet from our voices recorded 2 minutes later. But here is where the absolute horror set in. Liam and I had heard none of this while we were present there. Not a pin drop, not a sound. The recorders, isolated from any immediate mechanical interference, just caught this private moment of raw, visceral panic and sustained suffering that had occurred, unseen and unheard, right next to us. The chills racing down my spine were sudden and absolute. It was terrifying, not just because of the sound itself, but because it implied that some terrifying truth of that hospital was happening to a desperate level of awareness and isolation we couldn't perceive. Liam pointed towards the timestamp display on the audio. "Marcus, that scream! It was exactly 2 minutes and 20 seconds before we came in there. The energy of that moment was still hanging." Before I could process that, my shoulder went cold. Unnaturally cold. I mean, the kind of concentrated, vacuum-sucking cold that you instantly know isn't a draft. I looked down, and right on the sleeve of my jacket, there appeared a single, dark, wet spot. Within seconds, it evaporated, leaving behind a damp smell like sweat and metallic rust. Immediately after, a guttural sound came from the end of the hallway. 2 distinct, heavy footsteps, followed by the clinking of chains. This time, we all heard it. It wasn't on the tape yet, it was happening live. Liam didn't need to be told. He ripped his camera off the tripod and started sprinting towards the sound down the shadowy hall. I followed closely behind. We burst into the corridor, flashlights slicing the gloom, illuminating a wide expanse of peeling walls and broken floorboards. And there, halfway down, where the shadow of a decaying arch doorway fell, I saw a figure. Tall, gaunt, dressed in what clearly looked like an old, stained orderly's uniform. It wasn't transparent. It was solid, but its edges shimmered and fractured the light. The silence returned instantly, consuming even the footsteps we'd heard. The figure turned its head, and even from 40 feet away, with nothing but the low light from my flashlight, I could see 2 empty, dark eye sockets and a grim, cold smile stretched across its face. It felt evil, actively and deliberately malicious. It slowly lifted a heavy, ancient-looking straitjacket it held, moving as if preparing to take position. That's when all my years vanished. Instinct took over. Liam and I bolted out of there, leaving the gear and all our professionalism behind. We ran through the massive front doors and toward the sanctuary of the van. Nate, wide-eyed, was already hitting the gas as we tumbled in. We never recovered the rest of the gear. Blackwood gave us an undeniable truth. Some places aren't just haunted, they're actively looping a timeline of pure, unadulterated suffering. And those involved in the misery are keenly aware of every new arrival who intrudes on their eternal shift. Story 2. I've always been the type of guy who looks for a logical explanation. I work in IT, I deal with code, with ones and zeros, things that make sense. So when I bought the Victorian fixer-upper in a quiet town just outside of Boston, I wasn't worried about ghosts. I was worried about the plumbing, the wiring, and the roof. The house was a steal, mostly because it had sat empty for nearly a decade. The realtor mumbled something about the previous owner passing away and the estate taking years to settle, but I didn't care. I signed the papers, grabbed my toolbox, and moved in. For the first 2 weeks, everything was great. It was hard work, sure, scraping off layers of wallpaper that smelled like ancient dust and tobacco, but it was satisfying. The trouble started when I decided to tackle the basement. It was a typical New England basement, stone foundation, damp floor, low ceilings. I wanted to put up some drywall to create a small home office down there. I was scanning the far wall with a stud finder when I got weird readings. It wasn't consistent. I knocked on the concrete, and instead of a solid thud, a section of it sounded hollow. Not just a little hollow, but like there was a significant void behind it. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a sledgehammer. It took about 20 minutes of sweating and swinging before the old plaster and lath gave way, revealing a wooden board. I pried that off, and suddenly, I was staring into a pitch-black space that wasn't on the blueprints. It was a room, maybe 4 feet by 6 feet. A hidden crawl space. The air that drifted out was stagnant, cold, and smelled faintly of copper and wet earth. I shined my flashlight inside. It was empty, except for a small, singular wooden chair sitting right in the middle, facing the wall I had just broken through. It was unsettling, sure, but I figured maybe a previous owner used it for storage or a panic room and then sealed it up. I planned to clean it out the next weekend and expand my office space. That was my mistake. I should have sealed it back up immediately. That night was the first time I heard the noises. I was sleeping on the second floor, 2 flights of stairs up from the basement. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound that made my skin crawl. It was a rhythmic scratching. Scritch, scritch, pause. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls, traveling upward. I told myself it was rats. I just opened up a sealed space. I'd probably let some rodents loose. I went back to sleep, pulling the duvet over my head. Over the next few days, things escalated from noises to physical displacement. I'm organized. I leave my keys in a bowl by the door. Wednesday morning, they were on the kitchen floor. My hammer, which I had left in the basement, was sitting on my dining room table. I thought I was losing my mind, maybe sleepwalking due to the stress of the renovation. But the atmosphere in the house had changed. It felt heavy. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and an argument has just ended? The air felt electric and hostile. On Saturday night, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. I was watching TV in the living room, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I felt exposed. I turned off the TV and the house was dead silent, but I could swear I heard shallow, wheezing breathing coming from the hallway darkness. I checked everywhere. Locked the doors. Checked the basement. The hole in the wall was gaping like a black mouth, silent. I went to bed, but I grabbed an old hunting knife I kept in the closet and slid it under my mattress. I also set up a small motion-activated security camera on my dresser, pointing at the bed. I needed to know if I was sleepwalking. I slept terribly. I had dreams of long, pale fingers prying open my eyelids. When I woke up, the sun was shining, and I felt a little silly. The fear of the night always evaporates in the morning light. I made coffee and sat down to check the footage from the camera app on my phone, expecting to see myself tossing and turning. The first few hours were boring. Just me sleeping. Then, the timestamp hit 3:14 a.m. The motion sensor triggered. I leaned in closer to the screen, and my blood turned to ice. The door to my bedroom, which I distinctly remembered closing, slowly creaked open. At first, I saw nothing. Then, from the bottom of the frame, something crawled in. It was moving on all fours, but the limbs were too long, with too many joints. It was pale, naked, and hairless. It looked like a human that had been stretched on a rack. It didn't look at the camera. It crawled silently to the side of my bed. I watched, horrified, as this thing stood up. It was tall, looming over my sleeping form. It didn't attack. It didn't scream. It just leaned down, its face inches from mine. On the video, I could see its jaw unhinged slightly, hovering over my ear, as if it were listening to my dreams or whispering something I couldn't hear. It stood there for an hour. An entire hour of stillness, just watching me sleep. Then, just before dawn, it dropped back to all fours and scuttled backward out of the room, closing the door gently behind it. I didn't pack. I didn't wash my coffee cup. I grabbed my wallet and keys, ran out the front door, and got into my car. I drove until I was 3 states away. I put the house on the market the next day, selling it, as is, to an investment company for way less than I paid. I never told them about the room in the basement. I never told them about the footage. I just hoped they didn't open that wall. But sometimes, late at night in my new apartment, I hear a scratching in the walls, and I wonder if it followed me, or if I'm just waiting for the door to creak open again. Story 3. There is an old rule in Appalachia that my grandfather used to tell me, a rule that I thought was just superstition until last October. He used to say, "If you hear a whistle in the woods at night, know you didn't. And for God's sake, never whistle back." I always laughed it off as hillbilly folklore, the kind of thing old men say to scare kids into behaving. That skepticism is exactly why I almost died on a camping trip with my 2 best friends, Mark and Sarah. We decided to hike a remote section of the trail, miles away from the popular tourist spots and designated campsites. We wanted true isolation, to get away from cell service and city noise. We found a perfect clearing near a creek as the sun was setting on the first day. It was beautiful, ancient, and quiet. Too quiet. As we got the fire roaring and cracked open a few beers, the atmosphere felt heavy, like the trees were leaning in to listen to us. I was in high spirits, feeling the buzz of the alcohol and the freedom of the woods. I started whistling a catchy tune, some pop song that had been stuck in my head all week. Mark looked up from the fire, his face serious. He told me to knock it off, reminding me of the local legends. I just rolled my eyes and whistled louder, purely to annoy him. That's when it happened. From deep within the darkness, beyond the ring of firelight, a whistle came back. It wasn't an echo. It was the exact same tune I had just whistled, but the pitch was wrong. It was flat, mechanical, like someone trying to play a flute with broken fingers. I stopped. Sarah laughed nervously and asked if there was another campsite nearby. We all listened. Silence. Then, we heard the sound of a twig snapping, heavy and deliberate, maybe 50 yards out. We shouted out, "Hello?" but got no response. We spent the rest of the night clutching our hatchets, but nothing else happened. The second night, we hiked 10 miles further in. We were exhausted. We set up camp, and I made sure to keep my mouth shut. No whistling, no loud noises. We were sitting around the embers of the fire, whispering, when we heard it again. This time, it wasn't far away. It sounded like it was just outside the perimeter of our camp. It whistled the same song from the night before. Then it changed. It started mimicking voices. Specifically my voice. It said, "Hello? Is anyone there?" But the cadence was all chopped up, like a recording being played backward and then forward. Sarah started crying silently. Mark grabbed his flashlight and swept the beam across the tree line. For a split second, the light caught something. It looked like a pale, white tree trunk, but then it bent at an impossible angle, like a knee joint, and ducked behind a thick oak. It was tall. Way too tall to be a bear or a person. We didn't sleep that night. We kept the fire high and sat back to back. By dawn, we made the decision to hike back to the car. It was a 15-mile trek, but we didn't care. We packed up in record time and started moving. The woods felt hostile. The birds weren't singing. The squirrels weren't moving. It was dead silence, except for our boots on the leaves. About halfway back, I got separated from Mark and Sarah when I stopped to tie my boot. When I stood up, I couldn't see them around the bend. I shouted their names. From the trees to my left, I heard Sarah's voice. "Over here! Help me!" It sounded frantic. I turned to run toward her voice, but then I froze. The voice was coming from 20 feet up in the air, from the canopy of the trees. Humans don't scream from the treetops. I looked up, and my blood turned to slush. Perched in the branches was a creature that I can only describe as a mockery of the human form. It had skin the color of spoiled milk, stretched tight over jagged bones. Its limbs were elongated and had too many joints. But the face was the worst part. It didn't have a face, just a smooth surface of flesh where eyes and a nose should be, and a gaping, circular mouth that was mimicking Sarah's screams perfectly. I didn't scream. I didn't think. I just ran. I ran faster than I have ever run in my life, tearing through briars and sliding down embankments. I caught up to Mark and Sarah a mile down the trail. They had heard the screaming too and were terrified. I didn't explain, I just shoved them and yelled, "Run! Don't look back!" We could hear it crashing through the canopy behind us, swinging from tree to tree with a terrifying grace. It was whistling that damn song again, louder and louder, overlapping with the sound of my own voice screaming for help. We burst out of the tree line and into the parking lot just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. We threw our gear in the back and scrambled into the car. As I fumbled with the keys, Mark screamed and pointed at the edge of the woods. Standing just behind the trailhead sign was the creature. It was standing on two legs now, towering over the sign. It raised a long, spindly hand and waved at us, a stiff, unnatural motion. As we peeled out of the parking lot, the last thing I heard over the roar of the engine was a sharp, piercing whistle cutting through the air. I haven't been camping since. And if you ever find yourself in the Appalachian woods, keep your mouth shut. Because if you whistle, something might just decide to whistle back. Story 4. I've worked a lot of dead-end jobs in my life, but the graveyard shift at the 24-hour gas station off Interstate 40 was by far the strangest. It was one of those places in the middle of the desert where the darkness feels heavy, pressing against the glass windows of the brightly lit convenience store. When I was hired, the manager, a jittery guy named Earl, didn't ask for a resume. He just asked if I could stay awake and if I was good at following instructions. When I said yes, he handed me a laminated sheet of paper and told me to memorize it. He wasn't joking. The list wasn't normal. It had things like, check the bathrooms every hour, which was fine, but then it had rules like, if the phone rings twice and stops, do not pick it up, and, if a man in a green trench coat enters between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., do not look him in the eye. Serve him, take his cash, but stare at the counter. I thought it was a hazing prank for the new guy. For the first month, nothing happened. I spent my nights stocking shelves, drinking stale coffee, and reading paperbacks. The isolation was the hardest part. Sometimes hours would pass without a single car pulling up to the pumps. But then came the Tuesday of my 5th week. It was a particularly windy night, and the sign outside was creaking loudly. The clock on the wall ticked over to 3:15 a.m. I was wiping down the hot dog roller when the electronic chime of the door sounded. I looked up, expecting a trucker or a weary traveler. Instead, a man walked in wearing a heavy, dark green trench coat. It was middle of summer, easily 80 degrees out even at night, so the coat was immediately a red flag. He was tall, unnaturally thin, and his movements were jerky, like a marionette being controlled by an amateur. My heart hammered against my ribs. I remembered the list. Do not look him in the eye. I immediately dropped my gaze to the countertop, focusing intently on the scratched laminate and the lottery ticket display. I heard his boots squeak across the linoleum floor. They were wet, heavy footsteps, leaving a sound like squishing sponges, even though it hadn't rained in weeks. He walked straight to the counter and stopped. The smell hit me first. It wasn't body odor. It smelled like ozone, sulfur, and something metallic, like old copper coins. Pack of reds? A voice rasped. It sounded like two pieces of sandpaper rubbing together, completely devoid of any human inflection. I reached behind me, grabbing the cigarettes without lifting my head. I slammed the pack on the counter. That'll be $10.50, I said, my voice shaking slightly. I was staring at his hands. They were pale, almost gray, and the fingers were too long. The fingernails were black and cracked. He didn't move for a solid minute. The silence stretched out, suffocating. I could feel his gaze burning into the top of my head. I had this overwhelming, primal urge to look up, to see what kind of face belonged to that voice. It took every ounce of willpower to keep my eyes locked on the register. Finally, a crumpled, damp $20 bill was slapped onto the counter. It felt slimy to the touch. I quickly punched in the numbers, the drawer popped open, and I counted out the change. I pushed the bills and coins toward his hand. Keep the change, the voice said. And tell Earl he can't hide forever. That was it. He turned around and walked out. The chimes sounded again. I waited until I saw the taillights of a car, an old model, maybe from the 50s, completely black with no license plates, pull away from the pump area. Only then did I look up. The air in the store felt freezing cold, despite the AC being set to low. I looked at the money he had given me. It wasn't a current $20 bill. It was an old bill, a series from 1934, and it was stained with a rusty, reddish-brown substance that looked terrifyingly like dried blood. I didn't wait for the morning shift. I locked the doors, left the keys on the counter along with a note that said, "I quit," and drove home. I never went back for my last paycheck. A few weeks later, I drove past that exit during the day, just out of curiosity. The gas station was boarded up, surrounded by police tape. I checked the local news and found a small article stating that the manager, Earl, had gone missing under suspicious circumstances. They found signs of a struggle in his office, but no body. All they found was a single, damp $20 bill from 1934 on his desk. I still have nightmares about that voice, and sometimes, when I'm driving at night and see a lone gas station, I just keep driving, no matter how empty my tank is. Story 5. Story 4. My friends and I used to call ourselves urban explorers, but looking back, we were just trespassers looking for a thrill. We'd hit up abandoned factories, old malls, and forgotten farmhouses across the Rust Belt. We had a rule: take nothing but photos, leave nothing but footprints. We thought we were respectful. We thought we were safe. That changed when we decided to check out the St. Jude's Psychiatric Hospital in rural Pennsylvania. It had been closed since the late 80s due to a mix of funding cuts and abuse allegations. The forums online said it was haunted, but we didn't care about ghosts. We cared about the architecture and the creepy atmosphere. It was me, my best friend David, and his cousin Leo. We parked the car a mile down the road and hiked through the dense woods to avoid the security patrol that supposedly checked the perimeter. The building was a massive, rotting hulk of brick and ivy looming against the night sky. Most of the windows were smashed, looking like jagged, black eyes staring down at us. We found a service entrance around the back where the heavy steel door had been pried open just enough to squeeze through. The smell hit us immediately, a mix of wet rot, asbestos, and something sickly sweet, like fermenting fruit. We clicked on our heavy-duty flashlights and started sweeping the ground floor. It was standard stuff: peeling paint, rusted gurneys left in hallways, patient files scattered across the floor like dead leaves. We spent an hour exploring the upper wards, taking photos of the isolation cells and the graffiti left by other explorers. It was creepy, sure, but not terrifying. Not yet. We decided to head down to the basement. That's where the morgue and the boiler room were supposed to be. As we descended the concrete stairs, the air got significantly colder. I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight. At the bottom of the stairs, there was a long, tunnel-like corridor. The acoustics were strange down there. Every step we took echoed for too long, sounding like someone was walking behind us. About halfway down the hall, we found a heavy iron door that looked different from the others. It didn't have a window. It was slightly ajar. David pushed it open with his boot. Inside, the room wasn't dusty. In fact, it looked like it had been swept recently. In the center of the floor, drawn in what looked like white chalk, was a complex geometric symbol, circles within triangles, surrounded by symbols I didn't recognize. In the corners of the room were piles of burnt candles. This wasn't graffiti, this was active. "We need to go," I whispered, a knot of dread forming in my stomach. "Wait," Leo said. He was standing in the middle of the circle, staring down at the chalk. "Look at the detail. This isn't just some kids messing around." "Leo, seriously, let's go," David said, reaching out to grab his cousin's shoulder. When David touched him, Leo snapped his head up. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated so much his eyes looked entirely black. He didn't look at David, he looked through him. Then, Leo started to hum. It was a low, vibrating hum that seemed to resonate in my chest. "Leo?" I asked, stepping back. Leo opened his mouth and spoke, but the voice wasn't his. It was deeper, guttural, and sounded like he had gravel in his throat. He spoke a string of words in a language that sounded like Latin, but harsher. Non-exit. Non-exit. David shoved Leo. "Snap out of it, man, you're freaking us out." Leo stumbled back, blinked, and the tension seemed to leave his body. He looked around, confused. "What? Why are you guys yelling? You were talking weird, man. Let's get the hell out of here," I said. We turned to leave, but when we stepped back into the hallway, it was different. I swear to God, the corridor was longer. The stairs we had just come down were gone, replaced by a flat wall of brick. Panic set in instantly. We ran in the opposite direction, our flashlight beams bouncing frantically off the walls. We ran for what felt like 5 minutes in a straight line, but we never reached the end. Doors passed us by, room 102, room 103, room 104, and then we'd pass room 102 again. We were in a loop. "It's not real, it's not real," David was chanting, hyperventilating. Leo was lagging behind. I turned to check on him and saw something that made me almost drop my light. Emerging from the shadows of the ceiling, hanging like a spider, was a figure in a tattered nurse's uniform. Its face was covered by long, matted hair. It wasn't attacking, it was just watching us run, crawling along the pipes overhead, keeping pace with us. "Run faster!" I screamed. We sprinted blindly. I saw a fire exit sign glowing faintly red in the distance. We bolted toward it. The door was chained shut. David and I slammed our bodies against it, the metal groaning. I could hear the scuttling sound getting closer behind us, the sound of wet meat slapping against metal pipes. With one final, adrenaline-fueled heave, the rusty bracket holding the chain snapped. We burst out into the cool night air, tumbling down a grassy embankment. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. We drove in silence for 20 minutes before anyone spoke. Leo was in the back seat, pale and shivering. I looked in the rearview mirror to ask him if he was okay. He was staring out the window, tracing shapes on the glass with his finger. When we passed under a street lamp, I saw what he was drawing. It was the same geometric symbol from the floor of the basement. He caught my eye in the mirror and smiled, a slow, knowing smile that didn't reach his eyes. We dropped him off at his house, and I haven't spoken to him since. David told me Leo had a breakdown a month later and was institutionalized. I don't know where he is now, but I know I'm never going into an abandoned building again. Some places are empty for a reason. Story 6. I've dealt with sleep paralysis since I was a teenager. If you've never had it, count yourself lucky. It's not just a bad dream, it's a physiological cage. Your mind wakes up fully conscious, but your body is still chemically locked in REM sleep. You can't move a finger, you can't scream, and you can't close your eyes. But the worst part isn't the paralysis, it's the hallucinations. Your panic brain tries to explain why you're frozen, so it projects nightmares into the real world. For years, I saw the usual stuff: spiders on the ceiling, a heavy weight on my chest. But about 6 months ago, the visitor changed. I started seeing the Hat Man. He's a common figure in paralysis lore, which makes it even more terrifying. It's a shadow figure, darker than the dark of the room, distinct and solid. He wears a long trench coat and a wide-brimmed fedora. He usually stands in the corner of my bedroom, near the closet, just watching. For months, that's all he did. He stood there, radiating a malice that felt like cold radiation. I'd lie there, struggling to breathe, mentally screaming at my toes to wiggle, until I finally snapped awake, gasping for air, and he would vanish. Last Tuesday, the routine broke. I woke up at exactly 3:33 a.m. My room was bathed in the weak orange glow of the streetlights outside. I tried to lift my arm, nothing. Dead weight. Panic set in immediately. I darted my eyes to the corner. He was there. But he wasn't standing still. For the first time, he was moving. He took a step forward. I heard the floorboard creak. That shouldn't happen. Hallucinations are visual. They don't make the floorboards of a cheap apartment groan under weight. He walked slowly toward the bed. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would bruise. He stopped right at the edge of my mattress. He was tall, looming over me. Up close, the shadow wasn't just black. It was like looking into a void where light went to die. I couldn't see a face, just the suggestion of depth beneath the brim of that hat. Then, he did something that made my blood freeze. He sat down on the edge of the bed. I felt the mattress dip. I felt his weight. I felt the cold emanating from him, chilling my skin through the duvet. This wasn't a hallucination. This was physics. He leaned over me, and I felt a gloved hand wrap around my throat. It wasn't tight enough to choke, but it was possessive. He leaned in close, right by my ear, and for the first time, he spoke. His voice sounded like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "Almost time," he whispered. "I just need a little more fear." I squeezed my eyes shut, praying, counting backward from 10, doing anything to wake up. The pressure on my throat increased. I felt the leather of the glove against my skin. I summoned every ounce of willpower I had and tried to scream. A strangled, pathetic whimper escaped my lips, and suddenly, the paralysis broke. I sat up violently, throwing a punch at the empty air, shouting. The room was empty. The streetlights cast long shadows, but the corner was clear. I was sweating, my heart racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I turned on the bedside lamp, flooding the room with light. "It was just a dream," I said aloud, trying to stabilize my breathing. "Just a dream." I swung my legs out of bed to go get a glass of water. That's when I saw it. On the floor, right where the entity had been standing before he sat on the bed, was a fedora. It wasn't mine. I don't own hats. It was old, dusty, and looked like it was made of a black felt that absorbed the light from the lamp. I stared at it for a long time, too terrified to touch it. I grabbed my phone and left the apartment immediately. I stayed at a hotel that night. When I came back the next day with a friend, the hat was gone. But now, I'm afraid to go to sleep. Not because I'm afraid I won't wake up, but because I'm afraid of what will be waiting for me when I do. He said he needed a little more fear. I think he got it. Story 7. My wife, Emily, and I moved to a cabin in the foothills of the Cascades about a year ago. It was our dream home, isolated, surrounded by towering pines, and miles away from the nearest neighbor. We wanted peace and quiet, and for the most part, that's what we got. But living that far out in the sticks changes you. You start to listen to the woods. You start to realize that silence isn't empty, it's waiting. Last month, on a rainy Tuesday, Emily went to bed early with a migraine. I stayed up in the living room to finish a movie. It was around 11:30 p.m. when the rain stopped, leaving that heavy, dripping silence outside. I turned off the TV and was walking to the kitchen to get a glass of water before bed when I heard it. "David? Can you come here for a second?" It was Emily's voice. It was clear as day, coming from the backyard. I froze with my hand on the refrigerator door. It didn't make sense. I had watched her walk up the stairs and into our bedroom an hour ago. I figured maybe she had woken up and gone outside to check on the garden or something, though in the dark and wet mud, that seemed unlikely. "Emily?" I called out, walking toward the sliding glass back door. "David, please. I hurt my ankle. Come help me," her voice replied. It sounded exactly like her. The cadence, the pitch, even the specific way she said my name. But something was off. It was too flat. There was no pain in the voice, despite her saying she was hurt. It sounded like a high-quality recording being played back. Still, concern overrode my instinct. I reached for the handle of the sliding door. My hand was touching the cold metal latch when a thought hit me. Why didn't the motion sensor floodlights turn on? If she was out there on the patio, the yard should be lit up like a stadium. I hesitated. I peered through the glass into the pitch black. I couldn't see anything. "David, open the door." "It's cold," the voice said again. This time, there was a slight glitch in the audio, a tiny skip, like a scratched CD. David. A cold flush of adrenaline washed over me. I pulled my hand back from the lock. I turned around and sprinted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. I burst into our bedroom. The room was dark, lit only by the digital clock. I looked at the bed. There was a lump under the quilt. I crept over and shook it gently. "Em?" I whispered. She groaned and rolled over, blinking sleepily at me. "What? What's wrong? Is it morning?" She was warm. She was groggy. She had clearly been asleep for hours. My stomach dropped through the floor. "Stay here," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do not come downstairs." I ran back down to the living room. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want it to see me. I stood near the back door, keeping my distance. "David, why didn't you open the door?" The voice came again, but the pretense was dropping. It didn't sound like Emily anymore. It sounded like Emily's voice being spoken by something with a throat twice the size of a human's. It was deep, distorted, and mocking. I grabbed the heavy flashlight I kept by the back door and shined it through the glass. At first, the beam just caught the rain-slick deck. Then I swung it to the left, toward the edge of the forest. Standing just beyond the tree line was something pale. It was crouching on four limbs, resembling a human shape but all wrong, too long, too jagged. Its face was turned toward the house. It didn't have human eyes. It had two reflective orbs that glowed green in the flashlight beam. And it was smiling. A wide, impossible smile that stretched too far across its face. "Honey, please," the thing said, opening that horrible mouth, and out came my wife's sweet, caring voice, perfectly mimicked. I slammed the blinds shut and double-checked the lock. I dragged the heavy oak dining table in front of the sliding door. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the stairs with my shotgun, listening. For hours, it circled the house. It tapped on the windows. It tried different voices. It tried my mom's voice. It tried my best friend's voice. It even tried a crying baby. By sunrise, the sound stopped. I went outside with the gun in broad daylight. There were muddy prints all over the deck and smeared on the glass. They looked like handprints, but the fingers were 6 inches long and ended in claws. "We are moving back to the city next month. I can't sleep here anymore. Every time Emily speaks to me from another room, I have to physically go and see her face before I answer, just to be sure it's really her." Story 8. I took the job as a fire lookout in the Bitterroot National Forest because I wanted to disappear. Not in a criminal sense. I wasn't running from the law, but I was running from the noise of modern life. After a messy divorce and 5 years of working a high-pressure sales job in Chicago, the idea of spending 3 months in a 14 by 14-foot glass box perched 60 feet above the tree line sounded like heaven. I wanted silence. I wanted to read books, drink coffee, and watch the clouds roll over the mountains. I got the silence, all right. But it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind of silence that screams. My tower, designated Black Pine Watch, was one of the older models, built in the late 50s. It was sturdy, smelling of treated wood and propane, accessible only by a rickety set of wooden stairs that wound around the structure's legs. My only link to the outside world was a VHF radio powered by solar panels, connecting me to the dispatch center in Missoula, and to the other lookouts scattered across the horizon. For the first month, it was exactly what I needed. I fell into a routine. Wake up with the sun, brew coffee on the camp stove, check in with Carol, the dispatcher with the smoky voice, at 0800, and then spend the day scanning the horizon with the Osborne Fire Finder. The trouble started on August 14th. It was a Tuesday. The heat wave had broken, and the air was crisp, visibility endless. I was doing my morning sweep with the binoculars, scanning the western ridge, a particularly dense patch of Douglas firs about 3 miles from my tower. That's when I saw it. A flash of color that didn't belong. In a sea of deep greens and browns, there was a spot of vibrant, artificial yellow. I adjusted the focus. It was a person. They were standing in the middle of a small clearing, a meadow of sorts, about halfway up the opposing slope. They were wearing a bright yellow raincoat, the kind construction workers or fishermen wear. That was odd enough. It was 75 degrees out and not a cloud in the sky. But it was their posture that unsettled me. They were standing perfectly rigid, arms down by their sides, facing directly toward my tower. I grabbed the radio mic. "Missoula, this is Black Pine. I've got a visual on a hiker in Sector 4, near the Blind Creek bed. Over." The radio crackled. "Copy, Black Pine. Are they in distress? Do you see smoke?" Over. "Negative on the smoke, Carol. Just standing there. Looks like they're off trail. I'll keep an eye on them." Over. "Roger that." Let us know if they start a fire. Missoula out. I went back to my book, checking the meadow every 10 minutes. An hour passed. The yellow figure hadn't moved. 2 hours. Still there. By noon, I was using the high-power spotting scope. The magnification was strong enough to see details. It was a man. He was tall, wearing the hood up despite the heat. He wasn't looking around. He wasn't checking a map. He was just standing, like a statue dropped into the wilderness. By sunset, he hadn't moved an inch. I mean that literally. He hadn't sat down, hadn't shifted his weight, hadn't raised a hand to scratch his nose. The shadows of the trees lengthened and swallowed the meadow, and the yellow jacket became a dim gray smudge, but he was still there. I felt a prickle of unease. It's humanly impossible to stand that still for 8 hours. I radioed Carol again. Missoula, update on the hiker. He hasn't moved all day. I think he might be injured or stuck. It's weird, Carol. He's just staring at the tower. There was a pause. Maybe he's camping? Set up a tent? No tent. No gear. Just standing. I'm gonna shine the spotlight on him. I hit the switch for the million-candle power spotlight mounted on the railing. The beam cut through the twilight, illuminating the trees 3 miles away. I swept it until it hit the clearing. The light washed over him. Most people would shield their eyes or wave. He didn't flinch. The light hit him, and he remained a statue. I turned the light off, shivering despite the warm evening. I locked the trapdoor to the catwalk that night. Day 2. I woke up at dawn and immediately went to the scope. He was still there. Same spot. Same posture. It had been cold last night, near freezing. No human being could stand in a plastic raincoat overnight without moving to keep warm. I started to rationalize it. Maybe it was a statue, some art installation or a prank by locals. But I had scanned that ridge 100 times. It wasn't there 2 days ago. Around noon on the second day, the Ozark effect hit. If you spend enough time in the woods, you know the sound of the forest. It's a constant hum, insects, wind in the needles, birds, squirrels. It's a chaotic symphony of life. But sometimes, rarely, it all just stops. The silence slammed into the tower like a physical wave. No birds. No wind. Even the fly that had been buzzing against the glass pane dropped dead on the sill. The air grew heavy and metallic. I looked through the scope. The man in yellow had moved. He wasn't in the clearing anymore. He was at the tree line, closer. Much closer. He had covered maybe a mile in the blink of an eye, yet I hadn't seen him move. He was standing at the edge of the forest, right where the dense timber gave way to the rocky scree leading up to my peak. And he was still facing me. I grabbed the radio. Carol, I need a ranger out here. That guy, he's weird. He's closer now. Something's wrong. Static. Not just white noise, but a rhythmic, pulsing static. KCHK. Thump, KCHK thump. Carol? Missoula, do you copy? KCHK. Thump. The radio was dead. Day 3 brought the storm. Massive, bruising thunderheads rolled in from the west, turning the sky a sickly shade of green. The wind began to howl, rattling the glass panes of the tower. I felt exposed. A glass box in a lightning storm is not where you want to be. I was pacing the floor, anxious. I checked the scope. He was at the base of the tower. I dropped the binoculars. My heart hammered against my ribs. He was standing right at the bottom of the wooden structure, looking up. I couldn't see his face under the hood, just a black void. He wasn't holding a weapon. His hands were long, pale, and hung loosely at his sides. Hey! I yelled through the glass, though I knew he couldn't hear me over the wind. Get away from here! Lightning flashed, blindingly bright. When my vision cleared, he was gone from the base. Then I heard it. Thump. The sound of a heavy boot landing on the first wooden step. The stairs to the tower wind around the legs, 4 flights, 80 steps in total. Thump. Step 2. It was slow. Deliberate. heavy. This wasn't a man running up to seek shelter. This was a predator ascending to its nest. I scrambled to the trapdoor in the floor, the only way in or out. I checked the deadbolt. It was locked. I dragged my heavy footlocker over it, piling my water jugs on top. Thump, thump, thump. He was on the first landing. I grabbed my flare gun from the emergency kit. It was the only weapon I had. I retreated to the far corner of the cabin, pressing my back against the glass. Outside, the storm raged, rain lashing against the windows like gravel. Thump, thump. He was on the second landing. The radio suddenly sparked to life. No static. Just a voice. Clear as a bell, but it wasn't Carol. It was my voice. "Open the door, Jack. It's cold out here." I stared at the radio in horror. It was a recording of me talking to myself, but twisted, mocked. "Jack, open the door. The view is better from inside." Thump, thump. Third landing. He was 20 feet below the floorboards. I could hear the wood groaning under weight that seemed far too heavy for a human. The entire tower swayed in the wind, or maybe it was swaying from his climb. I aimed the flare gun at the trapdoor. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold it. "Go away!" I screamed. "I'm armed!" The footsteps stopped. Silence. Even the storm seemed to hold its breath. Had he given up? Had he turned around? I waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. An hour. Nothing. I slowly lowered the gun. I crept toward the floor, putting my ear to the wood near the trapdoor. I heard breathing. It was right on the other side of the wood. He was standing on the top landing, right under the door. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, waiting. I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner. Flare gun pointed at the floor, watching the handle of the trapdoor. Around 3 a.m., the lightning flashed again, illuminating the catwalk outside the glass walls. I saw a hand. A pale, wet hand slapped against the glass from the outside. He hadn't come through the trapdoor. He had climbed the outside of the tower. He was on the catwalk. I spun around, tracking the movement. He was walking around the perimeter of the glass box. Slowly. Dragging his hand against the glass. Squeak. He stopped at the window facing me. The lightning flashed again. I saw the face under the hood. It wasn't a face. It was smooth, pale skin. No eyes. No nose. Just a mouth. A vertical slit that had been stitched shut with coarse black thread. The mouth ripped open, tearing the stitches. The sound that came through the glass wasn't a scream. It was the sound of the forest. It was the sound of wind, of rushing water, of snapping branches, all amplified to a deafening roar coming from that gaping maw. I fired the flare. It smashed through the glass, exploding into his chest. Magnesium burned bright red, searing the night. The creature, or man, or whatever it was, didn't scream. The force of the impact knocked it backward, over the railing of the catwalk. I watched him fall, 60 feet down into the darkness. I waited for the thud. There was no thud. The sun came up 4 hours later. The storm had passed. I unbarricaded the door and ran down the stairs, jumping the last 10 steps to the ground. I ran to my truck and drove. I drove until I hit pavement, then I drove to the ranger station in Missoula. I told them I quit. I told them someone tried to break in. I didn't tell them about the face. They sent a team up to check the damage. They found the broken window. They found the scorch mark on the catwalk railing. But they didn't find a body at the bottom of the tower. They did find something else, though. In the mud at the base of the tower, there were footprints. But they didn't lead away from the tower. They led into the earth. Like whoever fell had simply dissolved into the ground. And inside the tower? On the inside of the glass, right where I had been sleeping the nights before? They found hundreds of fingerprints. Greasy, unrecognizable prints. They were on the inside. Which means he had been in there with me long before the storm. Watching. Waiting. Standing still. Story 9. I've been driving an 18-wheeler for 30 years. I've hauled lumber in the Pacific Northwest, livestock in Texas, and hazardous materials across the nightmares they call highways in New Jersey. You see a lot of strange things when you live your life looking through a windshield. You see accidents that make you question God. You see lights in the sky over the desert that move way too fast to be airplanes. And you see people on the side of the road who look like they've stepped out of a different decade. But every seasoned trucker knows the one thing you never want to see. We don't talk about it on the CB radio, but we all know the legend. The black dog. It's an old superstition, dating back to the days of horse-drawn carriages. They say if you've been driving too long, if you're pushing your logbook past the legal limits, pushing your body past exhaustion, the black dog appears. It trots alongside your rig, keeping pace at 70 miles an hour. If you see it, it's a warning: pull over, sleep, or die. I always thought it was just a hallucination, a trick of the brain caused by sleep deprivation. I was a rational man. I didn't believe in ghosts. I believed in diesel, caffeine, and making my delivery times. It was a Thursday night, late October. I was deadheading, driving an empty trailer, back from Reno on US Route 50, known as the loneliest road in America. If you've never driven it, the name isn't a joke. It's hundreds of miles of nothing but sagebrush, mountains, and an endless ribbon of asphalt that stretches into the black void. No streetlights. No towns. Just you and the high beams cutting through the dark. I was tired, but not hallucinating, tired. I had slept 6 hours in Ely. I was sipping a lukewarm coffee, listening to a talk radio show about conspiracy theories just to keep my mind active. The clock on the dash read 2:45 a.m. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, making the night unnaturally dark. That's when I saw it. At first, it looked like a shadow detaching itself from the darkness of the shoulder. I instinctively tapped the brakes, thinking it was a coyote or a deer. But as my headlights swept over it, I realized the scale was all wrong. It was huge. It stood as tall as the hood of my Kenworth. It was a dog, or something shaped like one, with fur the color of absolute nothingness, matte black that seemed to absorb the light from my high beams rather than reflect it. It didn't run across the road. It started running alongside the truck. I was doing 65. This thing was matching me, stride for stride, its paws making no sound on the gravel shoulder. I stared at it, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. It turned its head and looked at me through the passenger side window. Its eyes were red. Not the reflective red of an animal caught in headlights, but a glowing, internal crimson, like burning coals. My heart hammered against my ribs. "It's not real, Jim. It's the coffee. It's the shadows," I muttered to myself. I looked back at the road, focused on the white lines, and floored the accelerator. The engine roared, the turbo whined, and the speedometer climbed to 75, then 80. The rig shook. I risked a glance to the right. The dog was still there. It wasn't even panting. It was just gliding. Then, it did something impossible. It cut in front of me. I slammed on the brakes. The air brakes hissed and screeched, the empty trailer fishtailing behind me. I braced for impact, waiting for the thud, the crunch of bone and metal. Nothing. The truck shuddered to a halt in the middle of the highway. Silence descended instantly. The dust cloud from my tires drifted past the windows and the headlight beams. I sat there, breathing heavy, waiting for my heart rate to drop below stroke levels. I checked the mirrors. Nothing behind me. I looked forward. The road was empty. No dog. No blood. No roadkill. "Jesus," I whispered, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Okay. Okay. Message received. Next pull off, I'm sleeping." I put the truck back in gear and started rolling again. I checked my mirrors to merge back into the lane, even though I was the only vehicle for 100 miles. That's when I saw him. In the rearview mirror, reflected in the dim red glow of the cab's instrument lights, there was a man sitting on my bunk. The sleeper berth behind the driver's seat is my private space. It has a curtain. The curtain was open. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his legs dangling, staring at the back of my head. I almost drove off the road. I swerved hard, correcting at the last second. I wanted to turn around, to fight, to yell, but I was paralyzed. A coldness, absolute and biting, radiated from behind me. It felt like someone had opened a freezer door against my neck. I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the mirror. The man was wearing a trucker's cap, pulled low. He had a flannel shirt, faded and torn, and jeans that looked wet. His face was in shadow, but I could see his mouth. His lips were blue. Not cold blue, dead blue. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to sound tough, but my voice cracked. "How did you get in here?" He didn't answer. He didn't move. He just pointed. He raised a pale, gray hand and pointed a trembling finger toward the windshield. I looked back at the road. In the distance, maybe a half-mile ahead, I saw tail lights. That was impossible. I had been watching the road for hours. There was no one ahead of me. I was gaining on them fast. Too fast. It was another truck. A flatbed carrying steel pipes. I squinted. The truck looked familiar. The mud flaps, the specific pattern of dirt on the back. It was my truck. It was my flatbed. I blinked, shaking my head. No. No way. I looked in the mirror again. The man on the bunk was gone. The curtain was swaying slightly as if someone had just passed through it. I looked forward. I was right on the bumper of the truck ahead of me. I could see the license plate. It was my plate number. And then I saw the driver. Through the back window of the cab ahead, I could see the silhouette of the man driving. He was wearing my jacket. He had my haircut. The truck ahead of me suddenly swerved. It drifted to the right, the tires catching the soft dirt of the shoulder. The load of steel pipes shifted. The straps snapped. In slow motion, I watched the truck ahead of me jackknife. The cab slammed into the embankment, flipping over. The steel pipes, released from their bindings, transformed into spears. They flew forward, piercing the back of the cab, crushing the driver's seat. Crushing me. I screamed and slammed on my own brakes, skidding toward the wreckage. I closed my eyes, waiting to crash into myself. The sound of tearing metal filled the air. Then silence. I opened my eyes. My truck was stopped in the middle of the road. My headlights were cutting through the darkness. There was no wreck. There was no other truck. There were no steel pipes scattered on the asphalt. Just the empty, lonely road stretching out to the horizon. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't unclench them from the steering wheel. I looked at the dash. The clock read 2:45 a.m. The exact same time it was when I saw the dog. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I drove until the sun came up, white-knuckling it the entire way to Utah. I pulled into a truck stop diner at 7 a.m., looking like a ghost myself. I sat at the counter and ordered coffee. An old-timer, a guy with skin like leather and a missing eye, sat 2 stools down. He looked at me, really looked at me, and nodded. "Saw the dog?" he asked quietly. I froze, the cup halfway to my mouth. "What?" "The black dog," he said, staring into his own black coffee. "You look like a man who saw the dog." I saw something," I stammered. "Did you see the wreck?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "That's the gift," the old man said. "The dog doesn't kill you, son. The dog shows you how you die if you don't stop. You were falling asleep. Maybe only for a microsecond. But that microsecond was enough to kill you. The dog woke you up. The dog showed you the timeline where you didn't wake up." I quit long-haul trucking a week later. I took a job in a warehouse, driving a forklift. I don't drive at night anymore. I don't even like driving my car in the rain. Because sometimes, when I look in the rearview mirror of my sedan, just for a split second, I see him. The man in the flannel shirt with the blue lips. He's not on my back seat, but I know he's there, waiting for the moment I close my eyes for just a second too long. The dog gave me a second chance. I don't think I'll get a third. Story 10. I downloaded the Randonautica app as a joke. You've probably seen the videos on TikTok, teenagers setting an intention, getting a set of random coordinates, and finding a suitcase full of money or a creepy abandoned house. I'm 24, a junior architect, and I consider myself a skeptic. But it was a Sunday afternoon, I was bored out of my mind, and my roommate, Greg, was out of town. I figured I'd drive to a few spots, film nothing happening, and have a laugh about it later. I didn't realize that the algorithm doesn't just find random locations. Sometimes, I think it acts like a compass for things that want to be found. I sat in my Honda Civic and opened the app. It asked for my location and then asked me to focus on an intention. I closed my eyes. I felt a weird sense of melancholy that day, thinking about my childhood home that my parents had just sold. So, half sarcastically, I whispered, "Show me something lost." I hit the button to generate a void anomaly, a spot with statistically fewer quantum points than normal, whatever that means. The app processed for a few seconds and dropped a pin. It wasn't far. Maybe 20 minutes away, on the outskirts of town where the suburbs bleed into overgrown farmland and industrial power grids. The drive was uneventful. The radio played classic rock, the sun was shining, and nothing felt ominous. The GPS led me down a series of gravel roads until I reached a dead end near a massive electrical tower. The hum of the high-tension wires overhead was the only sound, a buzzing, electric drone that made my teeth ache. According to the app, the point was about 200 yards into the tall grass, right at the base of the steel tower. I got out, grabbed my phone, and started recording. "Okay, guys, I'm walking to the void point. Intention was something lost. Current status, lost my time." I chuckled at my own bad joke and pushed through the waist-high weeds. It was harder walking than I expected. Thorns snagged my jeans, and the ground was uneven. As I got closer to the tower, the buzzing grew louder, almost drowning out my thoughts. When I reached the exact coordinates, I looked down. I expected nothing. Maybe a beer can or a discarded tire. Instead, sitting neatly in a flattened patch of grass, was a black plastic trash bag. It wasn't weathered. It wasn't covered in dirt or leaves. It looked like someone had dropped it there 10 minutes ago. The knot at the top was tied in a perfect, tight bow. My stomach did a little flip. The first rule of these videos is don't open the bag. But curiosity is a powerful drug. I used a stick to poke it first. It felt solid, but not fleshy. It didn't smell like a dead body. I crouched down and undid the knot. Inside, there was a cardboard box. I opened the flaps. The first thing I saw was a blue flannel shirt. My breath hitched. I reached in and pulled it out. It was a child's size. And it had a very specific, iron-on patch of a rocket ship on the pocket. I had this shirt when I was 7. My mom had donated it to Goodwill 15 years ago. I turned it over in my hands, my mind racing. Coincidence? It has to be. Millions of kids had this shirt. I dug deeper. Beneath the shirt was a toy car, a die-cast 1967 Chevy Impala, painted black. I turned it over. On the bottom chassis, scratched into the metal with a safety pin, were the initials MD. My initials. Michael Davis. I dropped the car like it was burning hot. I sat back in the grass, the buzzing of the power lines suddenly feeling like a scream in my ears. This was my car. I lost it in a park 3 towns over when I was 10. How was it here? How was it in a fresh bag at a random GPS coordinate I just generated? My hands were shaking as I reached for the last item in the box. It was a manila envelope. It wasn't sealed. I slid the contents out. It was a stack of photographs. The first photo was of me, taken from a distance, walking into my high school. The second photo was me at my college graduation, but taken from behind a tree, partially obscured. The third photo was of me buying groceries. I looked at the timestamp on the bottom of the digital print. Yesterday. The fourth photo made me vomit. Literally. I retched into the grass. The photo was taken from inside a closet. I could see the slats of the closet door framing the shot. Through the slats, the camera was focused on a bed. My bed. And in the bed, I was sleeping. The timestamp was 3:42 a.m. This morning. I scrambled backward, crab walking away from the box, my heart slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone had been watching me for years. And they, or it, knew I was going to use this app today. They planted this here. This wasn't something lost. This was a message: I have your life. I didn't take the box. I didn't take the shirt. I ran back to my car, tearing my jeans on the thorns, not caring. I jumped in, locked the doors, and peeled out, kicking up gravel. As I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see a black car following me, but the road was empty. I got home and immediately called the police. I told them about the stalker, the photos, the coordinates. 2 officers went out to the location with me. When we got to the electrical tower, the grass was flattened. But the bag was gone. The box, the shirt, the photos, all gone. The cops looked at me like I was having a mental breakdown. They took a report but told me there was no evidence of a crime. I tried to show them the Randonautica history on my phone to prove the coordinates. I opened the app. The history was cleared. No record of the trip. But then, a notification popped up at the top of my screen. A new point had been generated without me asking. The pin wasn't out in the fields this time. The pin was dropped directly on top of my apartment complex. And the intention label, which usually shows what you typed, had text in it that I didn't write. It read, "Found you." I moved out the next day. I'm staying with my brother in Ohio now. I don't have a smartphone anymore. I use a burner flip phone. But sometimes, when I'm walking down the street, I get that feeling, the feeling of static electricity, like I'm standing under high-tension wires. And I know, somewhere, a camera shutter is clicking. Story 11. I found the diary during a weekend cleaning session. My therapist had told me to try and process some of my long-standing anxiety issues, suggesting that confronting childhood memories might help. So, there I was, sweating in the suffocating heat of my parents' attic, pulling down dusty boxes of old report cards and elementary school art projects. Buried beneath a moth-eaten teddy bear, I found it, a simple composition notebook with a camouflage cover, labeled in my childish handwriting, my private journal. I took it downstairs, poured myself a drink, and settled onto the couch, feeling a nostalgic dread. The first entries were normal kid stuff, complaints about vegetables, drawings of crude dinosaurs. But as I flipped through the pages, I started finding passages dedicated entirely to him, Mr. Hollow. Mr. Hollow wasn't my imaginary friend. He was my imaginary confidant and partner in crime. I had completely blocked him out. The name alone sent a shiver down my spine. The journal described him as being very tall, always wearing a suit that was the color of TV static, and his eyes were just deep, empty sockets. I was 8 years old when I wrote this. The entries weren't sweet. They were terrifying. September 12th. Mr. Hollow told me that Mrs. Henderson's cat is a witch. He said it would be funny if we covered its mouth with tape while it was asleep so it couldn't tell anyone our secrets. I did it. It wasn't funny. I told Mommy the cat was sick. Mr. Hollow said I did good. October 29th. Hollow showed me how to sneak out after Mom and Dad go to sleep. He says the shadows outside are safe. Tonight, he wants me to stand in the middle of the road and count how many cars stop. He says it's a game. I don't want to, but he says he'll stop talking to me if I don't. November 4th. Hollow is angry. I threw away my sandwich today. He said I have to be punished for wasting food. He told me to put my hand on the stove burner while Mom was in the shower. I didn't want to, but he made me. It hurt. Hollow said pain makes us stronger. As I read these, a wave of nausea washed over me. I remembered vague incidents. The cat getting sick, the burn scar on my palm, The time I was caught standing in the middle of the road at 4 a.m., all explained away by my parents as acting out, or sleepwalking. But the specificity in the journal, the descriptions of Mr. Hollow leading me, manipulating me, felt far too real for a typical imaginary friend. This wasn't a game. This was influence. I slammed the diary shut. I stood up, dizzy, and looked at the kitchen. Everything felt warped. The normal, comforting silence of the house was gone, replaced by a low, distant buzzing, the same electrical drone I remembered from my sleep paralysis experience years ago, only much fainter. I started pacing, trying to rationalize it, stress, suppressed memories, my imagination running wild. That night I couldn't sleep. I left the diary on my bedside table, unable to throw it away. I kept seeing Mr. Hollow in my mind's eye, the static suit, the empty sockets. At 2 a.m., I picked up the journal again, needing to find the final entry, needing to find proof that I grew out of this delusion. I flipped to the very last page. It was written in pencil, scrawled messily, clearly by my 8-year-old self. Final entry, December 18th. Hollow says he has to leave for a long time. He said I'm not ready yet. He says he will wait for me to get sad again, and then he will come back. He promised. He says he never breaks promises. I miss him already. I closed the book, relieved. He left. He was gone. It was just a weird, dark phase that ended. I tucked the journal under the pillow and finally felt calm enough to close my eyes. But as I lay there, waiting for sleep, I heard a faint scratching sound from the floor. It sounded like fingernails scraping across the wood. I opened my eyes. The sound stopped. I looked at the floor. Nothing. I looked at my bedside table. The diary was sitting there, exactly where I had left it. Except, the front cover was open. I sat up, adrenaline surging. The book was open to the very last page. The one where I had read my own goodbye to Mr. Hollow. But now, centered at the very bottom of that page, was a new sentence. It wasn't in my child's messy pencil. It was written in a perfect, elegant, adult script, in black ink that looked wet and fresh in the dim light. It read, "Hello, Alex. I told you I never break promises. I'm not waiting anymore. I'm here." I snatched the journal, the paper trembling in my hand, and flung it across the room. It hit the wall and slid to the floor, the cover remaining open. I backed away, my eyes glued to the dark corner of the room where the shadows were deepest. "Show yourself," I choked out, not knowing what I was asking for. The buzzing returned, louder this time, vibrating the window panes. I stumbled backward toward the bathroom, needing light, needing a mirror, needing to see if I was real. I flipped the light switch and stared at my own reflection. I looked panicked, exhausted, on the verge of tears. And then, in the mirror, behind my own shoulder, I saw him. He was faint, translucent, shimmering like heat haze off asphalt, but undeniably there. Tall, wearing the static suit and the wide-brimmed hat. No eyes, just empty sockets fixed on me. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't yelling. He was just smiling. It was a slow, sickeningly gentle smile that made the skin on my face crawl. "We have so much to catch up on." A dry, papery whisper echoed in the silent room. The sound wasn't coming from the mirror, or the room, or the ventilation. It was coming from inside my skull. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just watched his reflected image raise a static gray hand and place it gently on my shoulder. The second I felt the icy, bone-deep cold of his touch, the reflection vanished. I stood there, staring at the empty space behind me, knowing he was still there, now standing close enough to breathe my air. The buzzing stopped. The room was silent. I didn't need the diary anymore. I didn't need therapy. Mr. Hollow was home, and now, I'm afraid I'll never be alone again. Story 12. My wife, Sarah, and I finally achieved the American dream. We bought a house. It was a charming 1970s split level in a quiet cul-de-sac in suburban Oregon. We loved the large yard, the big brick fireplace, and the price. The inspection was clean, The closing was smooth, and we moved in with high hopes and dozens of boxes. The only minor issue was the aging HVAC system, which the previous owners hadn't used much, relying instead on space heaters. We called a contractor to clean the ducts right away. He said the system was old but functional, just dusty. We wish we had known what else was inside. The sound started the first night. We were trying to fall asleep in the master bedroom, which had one large air register right beneath the window. In the dead silence of the suburb after midnight we heard it. A soft, scraping sound, followed by a dry, rhythmic thump, thump, like something heavy and soft dragging itself across metal grating. We both sat up. "Rats?" Sarah whispered. "Has to be," I replied, grabbing my phone. I shone the flashlight beam directly at the register. Nothing. The sound stopped immediately. Silence. We stared at the register for 5 minutes. We both relaxed, thinking the vibration from the flashlight had scared it off. As soon as I put the light down, the sound returned, but this time, it was louder and closer. It sounded like it was right above the register, snuffling the air. The next day, I had the contractor come back. We checked the attic, the crawl space, and the outside units. No entry points, no nesting materials, no evidence of rodents. He sealed a few minor gaps and charged me an extra $100. Problem solved, I thought. But the sound didn't stop. In fact, it escalated. It wasn't always in the master bedroom. It followed us. If we were watching TV in the living room, we'd hear the scraping coming from the living room floor vents. If I went into the kitchen to make a late-night snack, the sound would move through the walls, arriving at the kitchen's ceiling vent seconds after I did. It was deliberate, controlled movement. It was hunting based on noise. I started experimenting. One evening, Sarah and I sat perfectly still on the couch. We didn't whisper, didn't shift. We sat for 20 minutes. Nothing. Then I dramatically cleared my throat. Immediately, there was a metallic scritch followed by a wet thump from the register right next to my head. It was reacting to me. The true horror started when it began to imitate. It wasn't mimicking human speech, thank God. It started mimicking the sounds of our routine. One morning, I was downstairs making coffee. Sarah was upstairs getting ready for work. I was about to hit the power button on the coffee maker when I heard the distinct click of the machine turning on, coming from the kitchen vent right above the counter. I stared at the machine. The power button was still off. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pushed the button myself. The original, actual click sounded tiny and weak compared to the loud, clear, imitated click that had come from the wall. Sarah started seeing things. She'd swear she saw shadows flicker across the vent slats when the lights were out. We began covering the registers with heavy mats and books, but the sounds just vibrated through the obstacles, muffling the scrape but magnifying the wet, snuffling breathing sound. It was smelling us. 2 weeks into this torment, we decided to break the system. We agreed we had to open a vent and face whatever it was. We chose the largest register in the house, the return air vent in the downstairs hallway. We armed ourselves with a baseball bat and a heavy flashlight. At 1 a.m., the scraping started in the guest bathroom vent, about 15 feet away. It moved, slow and deliberate, thump, scritch, thump, through the walls, heading toward the hallway. We could track its entire path. The sound finally stopped right under the massive hallway return vent. It was waiting. I slowly unscrewed the 4 screws holding the register grill in place. The entire house was silent, tense. I felt heavy, wet breathing against my hand as I worked. When the last screw came out, I snatched the grill away and pointed the flashlight down into the black abyss of the ductwork. The sound stopped instantly. The air inside the vent was cold, and it smelled strongly of ozone and stale meat. The beam of the light went down 6 feet, but I saw nothing but dust and rust. It was empty. We had scared it off. "It's gone," I whispered, relief washing over me. Sarah sighed and leaned against the wall. And then, every single vent in the house turned on. Not the HVAC fan. Not the blower. But the sound. Simultaneously, From every single vent in the house, the master bedroom, the guest bath, the kitchen, the living room, came a torrent of sound. It wasn't scraping this time. It was a guttural, wet, furious sound of heavy, rapid breathing. H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H. It surrounded us, coming from the walls, the ceilings, the floors, amplified by the metal ductwork into a roaring wave of animal rage. And then, mixed into the breathing, came the sound of Sarah's voice. "Kevin!" The sound rasped from the floor vent in the living room. "Kevin!" The sound repeated from the kitchen vent. "Kevin!" The sound hissed from the master bedroom vent, a chorus of voices repeating my name in a dry, horrible imitation. We didn't look back. We sprinted out the front door in our pajamas, leaving the grill on the floor and the hallway vent gaping open. We spent the night in a cheap motel. We didn't even bother to sell the house. We just signed it over to the bank, forfeiting the down payment. We told the bank we found black mold, but the truth is, the house was already infested. Infested with something that didn't just live in the walls, but had colonized the very infrastructure of our home, spreading its consciousness through the ventilation system, learning our names, and waiting for the right moment to come out. I now live in a third-floor apartment with no central air, and every time the neighbor's window unit kicks on, I flinch. Because I know that something that lives in the ducts doesn't need to break down the door to get to you. It just needs to travel. And it knows where you sleep. Story 13. I used to think the scariest thing about caving was getting stuck. The fear of being pinned between two slabs of wet limestone, 80 feet underground, with your headlamp running low, is a very specific kind of terror. But after what happened in the Ozarks last year, I know there are worse things than being stuck. There are things that want you to willingly crawl deeper, things that lure you into the dark because they know you can't resist the instinct to help. My buddy Sam and I were on a trip to map an unrecorded feeder cave near the Buffalo National River in Arkansas. It was a notoriously tight system, full of mud and water-filled sumps, but we were experienced. We went in with proper gear, climbing ropes, triple-check batteries, hard hats, and the cardinal rule of caving: always stick to the planned route and never go alone. We were maybe 3 hours into the cave system, well past the point where the air gets stale and the only light comes from the beams on our helmets. We had just finished maneuvering through a particularly nasty, tight squeeze, a section so narrow you have to exhale to fit your chest through, when we stopped to re-secure a safety line. That's when we heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A child was crying. Not a distant sound, but close. It was a thin, high-pitched, desperate sound that echoed off the wet rock walls, making it impossible to pinpoint the exact direction. It sounded like a little girl, maybe 5 or 6, and she was crying for her mother. We froze. Spelunking is dangerous. No sane parent brings a child this deep into a wet, unmapped feeder cave. Our hearts hammered. Had a family been caught in a flash flood? Had someone gotten separated? "Did you hear that?" Sam whispered, his voice tight. "Yeah," I replied, my voice sounding shaky even to myself. "It sounds like a kid. We have to go back and get help." The crying intensified. "Mommy! Help me! It's dark!" It was the universal sound of a child in absolute distress. Every instinct we had screamed at us to turn and run the 3 hours back out, but the human code of conduct won out. "It's too far to get help," Sam said, his face pale in the glow of his headlamp. "We have to try and locate her first." We moved forward, abandoning the safety protocol. We followed the sound, crawling over wet rock formations and through shallow mud pools. The crying kept leading us deeper, always just around the next bend, just past the next formation. It was a perfect lure. The deeper we went, the more frantic the cries became. Finally, the tunnel opened up into a cavern. It wasn't large, but it was wide enough to stand up in. We swung our lights around, scanning the floor. No child. No backpack. No gear. Nothing. We were alone. "Where is she?" Sam demanded, his voice cracking with frustration and growing fear. The crying suddenly stopped. The silence that rushed in was heavy and crushing, thicker than the air itself. The cave was now absolutely, unnaturally silent. I swept my light over the muddy floor. That's when I saw the footprints. They were fresh. Wet mud, clearly made within minutes. But they weren't the tiny prints of a 5-year-old girl. They weren't Sam's or mine. The prints were long, disproportionately narrow, and ended in 3 distinct, toe-like depressions. They looked like the footprints of a tall, thin bird that walked upright, but they were the length of a man's boot. And they led from the shadows of the back wall right up to the spot where the crying had been loudest. "We need to go," I whispered, the fear turning cold in my stomach. Now. We didn't wait. We turned and ran back toward the tight squeeze, scrambling over the rocks. We were 10 feet from the entrance to the narrow passage when the sound started again. It wasn't a cry this time. It was a high-pitched, mocking giggle, coming from the shadows of the cave wall directly behind us. The giggling was followed by a wet, clicking sound, like bones rubbing together. And then, the creature spoke. It used the child's voice, the sweet, innocent voice we had heard before. But the words were wrong. "You went the wrong way, Michael. Mama is not back there." It used my name. A name we had never said aloud since entering the cave. We panicked. Sam shoved me into the squeeze point. The space was barely wider than my shoulders, but adrenaline made me flexible. I squirmed and clawed my way through, tearing my clothing on the jagged rock. As I cleared the passage, I turned back and shined my headlamp into the gap to guide Sam. He was halfway through. His helmet was stuck tilted back. And then, something reached out from the darkness of the cavern and grabbed his ankle. It wasn't a hand. It was a long, pale, 3-toed foot. It was covered in thin, wet, hairless skin. Sam screamed, a real, visceral scream of pure terror. "Mike! Pull me! Pull me!" I grabbed his harness strap and pulled with all my strength. He shot through the squeeze, landing on the wet ground next to me, covered in mud, hyperventilating. We immediately scrambled to our feet and ran, our lights dancing wildly off the cave walls. We ran for what felt like hours, not stopping until we saw the faint, blessed circle of daylight filtering through the entrance opening. We collapsed outside, gasping for air and weeping. Sam's ankle was bruised where the thing had grabbed him, but otherwise he was physically fine. His headlamp, however, was gone, pulled off his head inside the squeeze. We never filed a missing person report. We told the local park ranger we got lost and had to abandon some gear. We knew they wouldn't believe us about the voice or the 3-toed foot. We didn't even believe it ourselves until 2 days later, when we were back home. Sam was looking through the photos on his camera from the trip. He stopped on a thermal image we took of the cavern floor before we saw the footprints. The image was mostly dark, but near the back wall, the thermal signature picked up a heat source. It wasn't human. It was massive, low to the ground, and glowing an unnatural, dark green. And then, in the very foreground of the image, right at the entrance of the squeeze point where we had stood, you could see a faint, tiny wisp of red heat. It was a reflection in the mud. And if you zoomed in, you could clearly make out 2 tiny, perfect 3-toed footprints. The thing hadn't been deep inside the cave. It had been standing right outside the opening of the cavern, hidden in the shadows, waiting for us to hear its bait and willingly crawl to it. It knew we would come. And it knew our names. We didn't go back for the gear. We didn't go back for the cave. And I will never again trust the sound of a voice in the dark.